Carstens. Welcome to In Conversation.
Hello, Lynn. A great pleasure to be in your program.
Mr. Carstens, people in Asia are extremely interested in cryptocurrencies, but central banks seem to be more wary. Now, why is that? Because after all, it looks as if it's a place where you make a lot of money.
Well, one of the key aspects of any central bank is that they should look after the public interest. Through history, you can see many different cycles through which private money tries to play the role of money. But time and after time, private money has failed to deliver what is the most important for the public interest of the people, and that is as a good store of value. And that's why central banks have been created. And I think that's at the end of the day why we are very worried about cryptocurrencies.
What would you say to a young, innovative person in Jakarta or here in Singapore who says, why can't I set up my own currency? It's going to be clever, flexible, it will be like nothing you've ever seen before, but it will be marvelous, and it will allow people to do all sorts of things that they haven't been able to do previously.
Yes, to create money is not only a technological problem. You need people to trust that money. And for it to be trusted, it needs to have all this backing that can only be acquired through time. Central banks have been working for centuries in getting where we are today. At the end of the day, what you can do today with central bank money, like Singapore dollars, is equivalent, or in some cases even better than what you can do with the cryptocurrencies. As a matter of fact, I could say that it's better. And central banks have been innovating for a very long time. The fact that you can make those payments 24/7 instantly is a result of a very intense work, very strong innovations that central banks have done, oftentimes in combination with the commercial banking system and with payment service providers.
But some economists have pointed out that it still is fairly costly to do transactions, and particularly in developing Asia, where many of the transfers are very small. I mean, the World Bank itself also says that even just $200, which is a very common amount transferred by many of our workers who may do more modest jobs, they're just transferring $200, and it's close to 6 point something, almost 7% in transaction costs for them. That's a heavy price to pay to banks and financial transaction institutions just to transfer an amount of money back home to my family.
Well, that certainly is the case. There are very high transaction costs, and it is a key objective for central banks and other financial authorities to reduce those costs. And we hope that we will be able to reduce those costs almost to nothing. For the first time in probably centuries, we have a situation where, from a global point of view, many central banks are looking into modifying this key aspect between central banks and society, which is to provide society with digital currencies to solve the domestic needs of the population. Is a steady evolution, no? What I would say also is that payments in cryptocurrencies are not necessarily best and safe. You have seen, for example, in the case of Bitcoin, in a matter of seconds, the value of the payments can vary dramatically. That's not what you want when you're receiving a payment in a currency. What you want is that, if you pay me 10 Singapore dollars, I will be able to spend 10 Singapore dollars. If you pay me 0.2 Bitcoins, I'm not sure if I will be able to acquire the equivalent in Singapore dollars. Therefore, it's not the same quality of money.
aspect of the cryptocurrencies, though, is actually something which is not a cryptocurrency. It's digital money. Now, it appears that central banks are very keen on digital money, maybe not so keen on cryptocurrencies. And definitely here in Asia, we are moving very fast forward. A digital yuan is coming up. Hong Kong is looking into it. South Korea is, and so is Singapore. Is Asia ahead of the game? Or are we actually rushing into it, that we shouldn't be going so fast?
Well, the issue of CBDC reminds me of something that Napoleon, this French uh, emperor, used to say to his valet when his valet was dressing him. If you remember a painting of Napoleon, he would have these coats with many different buttons, rows of buttons. So he would tell his valet, go slowly because I am in a hurry. Because what Napoleon wanted to prevent is that the valet would not put the buttons in such a way that his coat would be all crooked. I would say those words of Napoleon applies to central banks and CBDC. We cannot afford to make any mistake. We need the system to be fault proof. It needs to have the security against any cyber attack. If we think about it, the exchange of bills is a tremendously effective system. And if you want to mimic that in a really appropriate way, with the same trust that people have now when they exchange bills, is something that needs to be very seriously and it needs to be very thorough. So I think that this is the attitude that central banks are managing. Some are moving faster, some are moving with a little bit more of patience. Uh, each country is different. There is no one size fits all. Certainly, Asia has made this movement theirs, and I think they're investing a lot of resources and they're making very interesting and promising progress. But I wouldn't put this as a race. What is important is to get at the end of the line, but with a very safe, agile, attractive product.
Mr. Carstens, so why should an ordinary citizen trust digital currency but not a cryptocurrency?
Well, the main reason is because a digital central bank money is supported by all the institutional arrangements that are behind the central bank. I mean, the fact, for example, that the Singapore dollar is a stable, very, very coveted currency is not by surprise. Is not just by chance. It's because the Monetary Authority of Singapore and the government of Singapore have applied best practices in terms of monetary policy management. And what is the final objective? Is that that money is trusted. Cryptocurrencies, because they are not regulated enough, because they're very difficult to regulate, they also lend themselves to promote illegal type of payments, ransomware, and payments of narco trafficking, or payment of all illegal activities.
So, from that, though, could we say that in countries, though, where a central bank or government is not as trusted, that is why sometimes there's an opportunity for cryptocurrencies to arise when there are difficult situations? Let's take the example of El Salvador as well. They have decided they want to recognize cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, as a legal tender.
First of all, in Salvador, this is an experiment that they're thinking, but I think they need to think very carefully how far they want to go with it, because it's not guaranteed that the experiment will be a success.
When you say it's not guaranteed that it will be a success, what do you mean? That people will lose money? That
Well, imagine that you live in a country where the volatility of the currency that circulates is as high as Bitcoin. Just imagine that, you know,
A 30%
could you,
change within a few weeks. Yes.
in a few instances.
Yeah, not so good for buying your groceries. That's true. What about the question of anonymity, though? Because one of the very key aspects, even of our fiat money now, is that we can go and buy something, and in that sense, nobody needs to know. Do we want all governments to be able to look into all the payments that we are making, even though they're not illegal, but just because we want our privacy?
Going back to the social interest or to the public interest, this is an aspect that needs to be debated at the broad societal level, and it's one in which if there is an aspect where there is not one size fits all, is this one, because there are different societies, different political systems, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, this is a debate that needs to take place in the Singaporean society, in the Chinese, or in the Japanese, or in the Indonesian society, in Mexico, in the US, in Germany.
What about people who argue that it's an interesting form of investment, that with the incredible gains that you can have in cryptocurrencies, we've even seen some very prominent people saying that they think it's the future of money. Jack Dorsey, one of the co-founders of Twitter, has called it that, Bitcoin. And what about Elon Musk? What do you think of Elon Musk and Bitcoin?
Well, I don't feel that I need to make any opinion of these individuals. It's they are in the right to do whatever they want to do. But in cryptocurrencies, we only hear about the people who have made money, but we never hear about the people who have lost money. Just a few months ago, a few weeks ago, Bitcoin was over $60,000 per Bitcoin. Now it's around 30 or a little bit above 30. Their wealth has halved, and we don't hear those stories. So I think people have to be aware that the probability of losing a lot of money is very, very high, you know. Uh, on top of the fact that the Bitcoin money is not a transparent money and it can be manipulated. Therefore, obviously, if this is a matter of taste, there might be some individuals that like the excitement of being on a roller coaster. Well, if they want to do that with their own money, go ahead. But I wouldn't recommend it to the normal individual.
So you're saying that if a normal individual, a normal pension saver comes to you and says, Mr. Carstens, what do you think? I'm considering, adding Bitcoin to my retirement portfolio. What would you say to them?
I would say that it is not advisable. It's like going to the casino.
Here in Asia, the whole of COVID has exacerbated inequalities. Some economists, though, say that central banks have not necessarily played such a good role in some respects, and that, in fact, putting out a lot of cheap money with very low interest rates may be creating bubbles that we are going to have to face later on as we come out of the pandemic. Do you agree? Do you think that we now got a lot of bubbles of money?
In the long term, income inequality depends on structural issues, depends on the access to education. it depends to the actual access to health, it depends on the structure of the markets, it depends if there is an adequate governance and a legal system in a country. That's something where central banks cannot act, and we don't have an instrument to act there, and we shouldn't. We shouldn't. Our claim, and this is something that we documented in our annual economic report that we just published, is that if the central bank implements monetary policy actions that pursue their objectives that have been assigned by society, the income distribution impact is less than if they hadn't acted. So let me give you an example. Given the pandemic, we had to put the economy of many of the world, of the global economy, in animated suspension, to pursue a health objective. Now, given that this generated a huge collapse in economic activity, central banks used their instruments to try to make it easier for firms to survive, and whatever activity was possible, to reignite it as fast as possible. No? So, of course, monetary policy acts through interest rates. So for that, interest rates needed to be reduced. And that has an income distribution impact. But imagine what would have happened if the central banks hadn't acted in the first place. The consequence of the lockdown and the recession would be even worse, and the income distribution impact would have been even worse, So the point that we make is that when a central bank is pursuing its ultimate objective, which is to stabilize the economy, to help abate unemployment, to keep inflation under control, to keep financial stability, even in the short term, if there is income distributions impact, is much better if it wouldn't have acted.
So you're saying essentially that it's kind of like an unfortunate side effect that happened, that there is this increased inequality, but it's still worth it, is what you're saying. The other option of not having pumped the money in is even worse.
Absolutely. You got it right.
How then, though, going forward? How to bring that inequality, narrow it again, and that we don't end up in a permanent trap of very, very poor people who are in a really unfortunate circumstance where they haven't been to school now for a year plus, they haven't had a job for a year plus, and then we have an accumulation of some people who may in fact have made lots of money or doing very, very well out of this terrible pandemic. How is it we make sure that we don't make this a permanent situation, that the side effect ends up being a very nasty thing that ends up being a real sickness?
Well, of course, number one is to continue in this quest to really bring the pandemic under control through vaccination. Number two is to consolidate the positive effects that monetary fiscal policy have had in terms of limiting the damage on the economy. At the end of the day, what we need to do is to engineer additional growth, and each country should address the issues that shows that there are gains to be made if some reforms or some strategy is pursued. This is also important because growth cannot depend only on fiscal and monetary policy. We have used those instruments a lot, but at some point there are limits to the space of action of these policies. The key is to bring growth back and to bring back accelerated growth. that will be, I would say, the best way of achieving, a better sustainable path into the future.
Mr. Carstens, thank you very much for talking to us on In Conversation.
Thank you very much, Lynn. A real pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity to chat with you.